Invitations can change your life. How you respond to an invitation can change the course of your life. Welcome to HEARTtalk with me, Dr. Charles Lee. Welcome to part 2 of a 2-part conversation with Clinical Psychologist Christine Runyan. In this episode, Christine will explain further the distinction between tending and tuning in to one's own inner life, which is different from withdrawal and separation, both socially and ideologically. Christine then draws attention to the 2 core virtues of life. Number 1, paying attention to oneself is the bedrock for a life of love. Attention is the fertile ground in which love grows. And secondly, awareness. That self-awareness is the scaffolding for which well-being thrives and grows. Christine Runyan is a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is a Certified Mindfulness Teacher. She co-founded and co-leads Tend Health, a clinical consulting practice focused on the well-being of the mental aspect of healthcare practitioners. I'm Dr. Charles Lee and this is HEARTtalk. And now, let's talk again with Christine Runyan. So how are you?
I'm okay. Are you holding up okay? It's late your time. It's the very end.
I tell you what,
day.
the day has just started.
For me.
For me.
For you too.
Have you been to this part of the world?
I have not. No, when I was when I was 2 to 5, we lived in Korea.
Okay.
My dad was his career was in the intelligence community for the States, but I have not. I've been to Europe, but I have not.
I just want to tell you up front that it's fantastic. Thank you very much for doing this with me. It means a lot because there's so much ahead of us, and to be able to connect at this time is really interesting. And so I'm just going to go on now. And basically, I'm going to take on to follow through of what we did the last time, where we talked about the unexamined life and the power of pause, and how some of us, including myself, have to stop and take stock of what's happening in our lives. And now I'm just moving on to the examined life, okay, and the power of self. Because I think you have taken me through and you have taken us through this journey of finally finding out what's happening on the outside and neglecting everything on the inside. And now to just stop, pause, and take stock, and now start looking introspectively, which is something, Christine, that I never did in my 40 years as a doctor and 35 years as a plastic surgeon. Never once did I ever stop and ask and take stock and say, what's happening on the inside? Until I ended up on the table with open heart surgery. And so sometimes we do come to a state like that. And before coming on, I was playing my guitar.
Oh, lovely.
And this is something that I thought I should play and then take it on from me. Have you heard this one? Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. You know this one?
Yeah.
Where have all the flowers gone? Been long time ago. Where have, sing it to me, the flowers gone?
I can't
Gone
sing.
to graveyards, everyone. You know this part? When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Now, when I was playing this song, it was 50 years ago, right? 1960s, 70s. And the world was in a state of unknown. And it was Vietnam War. and it was a battle state ground. And they came up with this song because the girls were picking up the flowers and giving it to their loved ones, and they were all going off to battle. 50 years fast forward, today we are in a battleground and we have an unseen enemy. And while I was singing this song, I was thinking, where have all the smiles gone? Where have all the hugs gone? Where's all the love gone? I mean, this morning I told my own staff nurse, I said, let me see your face. I haven't, and we have lost that sense of being, in ourselves. I'm so delighted that how do we navigate through this, what is unknown now? Because this enemy is so unreal. It's malevolent. It's uncontrollable. We just do not know what's the next string that's going to come up. And you very rightly say in all your discussions that even though it's a shared reality, but it's not the same game for you and it's not the same game for me. So how do we take stock of what's in front of us, what's true in front of us, and navigate through this time of unknown reality and make it real, Christine? Take me to
maybe pick up on a couple of threads in what you've just shared, and thank you for that song. And you can sense how even just playing that, how we activate some of our different senses, really creates within us even a different physiology and a different way of kind of leaning in, right? And very much brought a smile to my face. I didn't sing with you because I am probably as close as one can get to tone deaf. But a couple things. I want to make a distinction between tending and tuning in to one's inner life and sort of withdraw and separation socially and ideologically. And I don't think those are the same thing. And so I just want to make a note about that, because so much of what we have been asked to do collectively has been to create this physical distance and to draw the perimeter pretty close in to our physicality. So even if there is a tendency with somebody that you might see out where your inclination would be to move towards, to shake hands, to hug, there's this like hesitation there because of this instruction the last year and a half that we've adapted to. That's a different sort of separation than when I think about sort of, and you talk about like tuning in. And paying attention to what's here, that one can do that while still sort of ideally having a very open stance to others. So you don't have to have this physical withdrawal or even social withdrawal to sort of reflect and tune in and pay attention to what's happening underneath one's skin. In fact, doing so is really in the spirit of having more of an open stance, kind of open palms, open heart to the world, to others like you, and certainly others not like you, in whatever dimension one is looking at. So I think that's an important distinction to draw. When we talk about paying attention to what's in here, it doesn't have to be this exclusive or seclusive experience. It actually can be both paying attention to this and sort of a collective stance. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very important distinction, isn't it? Because how much of it is the self, the recognition of the self, the importance of, say, self-compassion. I remember telling you my first interview with a psychologist in Sydney, and she said, be kind to yourself. And I was talking to a few friends today, and they said, ask Christine to expand on that. Because as medical professionals, we've just sold our lives out into a service industry. And we've never thought about the inner life. We know about the spiritual inner life, but there's also a mind-body connection that has been actually fractured in this whole environment. And then many of us are paying out now, stuff that's happening, it's amazing. In fact, today there was an article that came out where the hospitals are turning away patients because the ICU is full, there are no oxygen tanks, and and the doctors are facing the brunt. I mean, we are the frontliners, from the public. And so, and we go home and we snap like that, everything
Yes.
is short-tempered, you get angry and all that. So
Yeah.
give us some sense of a whole of how to navigate through this. I mean, you're a psychologist. You're the
Yeah,
you're the
I
point
wanna.
woman down.
I mean, one thing I think, really affirm and normalize, especially like for you as a physician and for your physician colleagues, is this pathway. And I think it's probably ubiquitous, whether that pathway is in the States or whether it's in the UK or whether it's in whatever system it's in. It pretty systematically kind of bakes out of the trainees the curiosity, in a sense. It almost really turns us away from curiosity, because it is such a service industry now, and because particularly with electronic medical records and with insurance companies, at least in the States, there's so much that's required to generate revenue that doesn't actually relate to the relationship with the patient or to probably even clinical outcomes, but does a lot of check boxes to generate revenue. And that that inherently cuts off curiosity, because curiosity is expansive. Curiosity takes time. Curiosity takes sort of that, investment, and that curiosity getting cleaved about others, I think also happens to self. So the medical education pathway, I think, is very ripe for taking really high achievers, really kind of bright, heart-centered caregivers who really want to do good in the world, who probably run pretty high on anxiety anyway, and then puts them into a culture that in many ways exploits some of those tendencies. And over time, until there is, your story is unique in that it's your story, but it's not uncommon in that it takes a crisis. It takes some external crisis for people to really stop and pause. And so I think the hope that I would like to offer is that that we don't actually have to wait until there's some external crisis, that this is on offer in the present moment for all of us to do some of that U-turn and be able to look at what's happening for ourselves. And I would say it really starts with paying attention. Paying attention is the fertile ground for love. We don't fall in love with anyone or anything we don't pay attention to.
Yeah, actually.
And so when when we start to have any kind of attraction or affiliation for somebody, romantically or otherwise, it's intertwined with paying attention.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
we
I mean,
really deeply pay attention. And
yeah.
so we can offer that. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like, we can offer that kind of attention to ourselves, and it really becomes the birthplace for love and for loving ourselves and tending to ourselves. But when we don't pay attention, when we cut off even some of our basic needs to hydrate, to eat, to go to the bathroom when we feel that urge to go to the bathroom and not keep going patient to patient, or I mean, there are times, I'm sure, times in the operating room where you have to make those adjustments, but we train people to ignore some of that stuff. And when you are ignoring and detaching from oneself, it's very hard to be loving and tender when you're not paying attention. So I actually think the hope I want to offer is something that all of us actually know how to do inherently, is to pay attention.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautifully said. And I wonder whether the name Tend Health came from there.
It did.
It's the core of attention, isn't it? And it's so beautifully said, because I think that if I look back now, paying attention is key to life. whether it's your inner life or whether your, nobody stops to observe what's going around. And we just drive to work and we come back, but we don't watch and we don't observe and pay attention to the things that are happening around us. And I think that's beautifully said. So give us a practical hold. Let's say, I like the way you talk about the arousal zones, the states where you can go into hyper and hypo, and a lot of times we fluctuate there. And that window that you talk about is so narrow now that as health professionals, they need to recognize that window and make it wider, isn't it? Take us there. I mean, tell us something about that.
Yeah, and when I do a lot of wellness or well-being workshops and instruction with I work with health professionals, primarily physicians, and I'll say, what do you think is the sort of the building blocks of well-being? And when we talk about wellness, what do you think is important? And people will say sleep, exercise, eating well. I mean, these are the core things that people will come up with. And rarely does anybody say self-awareness or paying attention. And for me, that is such the scaffolding for any of this in terms of well-being, because of if we don't have the capacity to know what's happening with us, with oneself, we are often tugged around behaviorally, emotionally, relationally, by things that that may not be so skillful, but are coming from the activation of our nervous system. And so when any of us get activated, and different things will activate me versus activating you, at different thresholds. And our responses to being activated, to having our sympathetic nervous system alert us to some potential threat, they're going to be different. We happen to have an equalizer here with COVID, and that it's unknown, that it's invisible, that it's uncontrollable, it's unpredictable. It has all of the elements for our nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system, to be throwing up a red flag that says threat, threat, threat.
Right.
And so most of us are carrying around a heightened level of activation, and then that wire gets tripped based on various things throughout our day. And for many people, what they will say is, their frustration tolerance is so much lower now. They used to be able to, tolerate traffic or somebody driving a little bit erratic on the road, and now they just can't tolerate that. And that has a lot to do with that window, our window of tolerance, of being able to move through our days with a little bit of regulation has been compromised for all of us because of this ongoing threat, because our nervous system we already have some vigilance there. So it takes a lot less to whether that's visual stimuli or auditory stimuli, or oftentimes cognitive stimuli, that trips that wire for us, where we're even more activated. And so that window in which we can tolerate things is less for all of us, because we've been chronically vigilant for a year and a half now, for most of us. And then the way in which those additional stressors manifest are going to be different for all of us as humans. So for some people, that additional stressor might cause you to really tuck in, and it might cause you to have a lot of GI distress, or a lot of headaches, or a lot of muscle tension. It might cause you to retract from the world. And for other people, it might cause some outward facing discharge of that stress, right? That shows up in irritability or anger or outbursts or impulsivity. Yeah. So it kind of varies interpersonally, like it varies at a population level, but then it can also vary intrapersonally. And this is why I say self-awareness is really the foundational, it's the bedrock, I think, for well-being, because we have to be able to know ourselves and what's happening underneath our skin with our own physiology, our own thoughts, emotions, bodies. We don't really
Yeah.
pay that much attention to our bodies so that we can respond to these things in a more skillful manner. If we can help regulate, get back into our window where we are tracking
Like
things a
like a
little more.
baseline, like as if
Yeah,
you're back to base. And
exactly.
and the frightening thing is, Christine, that sometimes you can feel numb. That
Hmm.
you enter into like when you have a cold drink and you get a brain freeze.
Yeah.
You feel that sometimes the numbers are coming out now that it's getting worse and worse in our place, and it's like just a number game, and it
Right.
doesn't hurt anymore. It's like, so what? That's it.
Yeah.
And that's a worry. That's frightening, actually, Christine, because the people are just becoming, as if it's a lifestyle now. But anyway, the bottom line is we can't miss out loving ourselves and those around us. We don't want to
Yeah, I
miss
think
that gift.
that's also that numbing, that desensitization is a real protective mechanism. It's a very
Right.
protective state
Uh-huh.
psychologically, but
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that there's often a quietness again, sort of within the system. There can be a lot of activation with with numbing. So it's because it's sort of a state of overwhelm. It's like too much.
Yeah.
And when we can, again, when we can notice that, when we can pay attention that this doesn't seem to be affecting me anymore, this doesn't seem to be registering, and we can open up to that reality within ourselves and make some space for it without judgment,
Right.
we can then start to see, well, what is that numbing really protecting me from? What might be lurking underneath that? Whether that is fear, whether that is intense despair, loss of hope. There's probably something underneath that exterior rigidity of the numbing that
Yeah.
is feeling protective because it's too overwhelming. But our tendency as humans, um, is to not pay attention to that
Right.
and then just move through the world like with this big armor and kind of numbness and sort
Yeah,
of
and
elbow
move
people out of
everybody
the
out of
way.
the way.
Yeah, yeah.
True, true. Yeah. And I think that your point about calling it out and naming it, and once we identify what is the main thing that's causing all the problem, which many of us don't do. I've never done that, to name it. You just go for it instead of naming
Long
it.
time
And
ago,
but that's wonderful.
where have all the flowers gone? Gone to young girls, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?
So this inner life of the health personnel is something that started 10 Health.
Yeah, so I can't remember how much I shared with you sort of my background as a clinical health psychologist. I've always been fascinated with this, intersection of allopathic sort of mainstream medicine and the mind and psychology and that mind-body connection. And so all of my career has actually been working in mainstream healthcare settings as a psychologist,
Uh-huh.
to work very much at that direct intersection, and then over time realizing that I was working at that intersection not just sort of with patients but with my physician colleagues. And
Right.
again, from what we talked about, sort of their training is so biomedically focused,
Mhm.
and so their interventions are very biomedically focused, and and oftentimes, they can get stuck when complex human beings are not sort of following, right, the protocol. Here's the algorithm.
I can resonate to that.
Yeah. Like, here's what's supposed to happen. Here's what the algorithm
Yeah.
says. And this is what up to date says. And this is what the outcome should be. And lo and
Uh-huh.
behold, like 50% of this is not, it's not tracking,
Yeah,
because
right.
there's all these other things that are, that are playing on this, the intersection. And so that was very much my interest, sort of clinically. And then also kind of them seeing like, oh, my physician colleagues don't have this in their training.
Yes.
They feel really frustrated a lot of times,
Yeah.
and don't want to be frustrated necessarily with patients, but it's frustrating to be in a helping profession, to want to do good and make changes, and to not feel like you're doing that at a rate of return that sort of was promised to you when you sort of went into the field. So I got very interested in looking at, well, what is in the medical curriculum around basically the mind-body connection? What is in sort of standard curriculum and training within residency to help people face the inherent occupational exposures that exist in medicine?
Right.
I found, not surprisingly, little to nothing. That there may have been in some ways, through some people's mentor relationships, a tacit, awareness around the stress of the profession, but there wasn't really anything explicit to help people with their day-to-day job is largely interacting with people who are scared, people who are stressed, people who are coming with a problem that they want you and hope that you can fix. And that's happening right now at a volume that is almost becoming impossible in some professions. I think certainly in primary care, it's certainly feeling like it's becoming an impossible task in terms of the volume. And there are these inherent occupational exposures that just weren't being, I think, labeled, and so people weren't having skills for how do I deal with my own frustration, my own sense of fecklessness around being able to help people the way that I thought that I could.
Right.
My own stress of trying to do this work and tend to things at home and life that happens that, as a psychologist, we work in that space clinically all the time,
Right.
and we do get some training for how, because sort of the self as the instrument in the work that we do get some of that training, but it was completely absent in most of the medical curriculum that I
It's the
that I
same
looked
thing
at.
here too. It's totally absent. I mean, nobody thinks about it, and now when we're having all these epidemics and pandemics coming up, it's like as if you're in a bubble. You're just insulated yourself in your own world, and then rolling to work and then rolling back in. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And
So that was really the inception of Tend Health, and sort of my interest in caring for clinicians.
wonderful.
And I worked for several years just caring exclusively for physicians, thinking of them as an underserved population, really, when it comes to mental health. At least in the States, there are a number of very real barriers for physicians seeking mental health care, including some states that ask very explicit and invasive questions about mental health diagnoses and mental health treatment on the licensing process, or
Right.
the relicensing process in the state, or also in credentialing applications for your clinics or your hospitals, or malpractice insurance. And so if you have sought care, if you have been given a diagnosis, or if you're taking certain prescription medications, sometimes this can really affect people's ability to practice their craft and to get credentialed. And so there's a lot of barriers for people. Somehow, if you need to get mental health care, you're weak.
Christine, you are at the right time for the right moment at this particular season, honestly, because I'm amazed when I hear of doctors, young doctors, who are burning out faster than ever. And when I think of my kind of training 30, 40 years ago, the discipline we had, And everything that they're having now is nothing compared to what we were, the way we were trained. And yet they're getting burnt out, you see. And it's like, the moment it's 3 o'clock, I'm finished, and they're out, and we used to go on till 6, 7, 8 o'clock and not grumble. So I think this is really the time of the season for you. I mean, you've come on the spot right now. And I want to just thank God for you. I mean, this is amazing because it's really the center focus of health. I mean, the whole profession was built on that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we expect a level of outward facing humanity from our
Right.
clinicians, but we don't actually create a culture that enriches and ensures that people are practice that same humanity towards themselves.
Sure.
And it shows up eventually. I mean, eventually, if you continue to sort of, bow at that altar of self-sacrifice and ignoring one's own need, eventually the price tag, that the price to pay gets higher and higher. And I think it often shows up in the body. It often shows up somewhere physically that almost sort of drops people to their knees to say, stop.
Right.
The body is not going to let you keep doing this at
Right.
this pace. And it's
So,
one of the things I
is it? I think it's pointed time to make it as part of the curriculum that mindfulness and the state of well-being in the health professional should be something that is recognized, because without a healthy mind, there's no healthy body, and
without healthy clinicians, there's not a healthy healthcare system. I mean,
right.
that
I
still
agree
don't
that.
have a system where robots are doing some cool things in the OR, but robots are not yet going to do it all. This is still, at the end of the day, a very human endeavor, and we have to ensure, I think, in many ways, that it stays very humane. And there's a lot of things about the healthcare system that I think threatens that, is pretty pernicious of how it treats clinicians, and not teaching them and training them, because it is a trainable skill. I mean, we think about training medical education and training the mind from a very top down, like fact-based strategy, right? So we do a lot of training of the mind, but we don't actually invite in a training of the heart, or a training of the mind in a way that I'm talking about, in terms of sort of paying attention to oneself. And that, at some point, yes, we need all of the medical knowledge, but we also have to, I think, pair that understanding that we have humans caring for humans, and bring more
Well
humanity.
said. Well said. And I think the beauty part of it is that the core of the central nervous system, as the main focus of all that is happening in us as we live, living a life itself. I think you are recognizing that as an important entity, that everything operates out of the central nervous system and not just the heart.
I mean, this is why I think in my, dropping into the body, and my own practice very much of my body as being both a barometer to help me understand what is happening with me in any given moment. When I can sort of turn the lens and really pay attention, I get a lot of information about how I'm doing from my body. And then to know that we can also work with the body to change and influence our cognitive state and our emotional state. And without that self-awareness, again, I really think that is the pinnacle. Like, without that self-awareness, we are much more likely to just double down on whatever is there. So if we're feeling tense, right, we end up thinking about things that create more tension. And then we get more tense. And then we get, and then we're likely to start acting from that place. It's just very human. When you shine the light of awareness, you can recognize that. And with practice, you can start to get that feedback closer and closer and closer to the point of sort of stimulus and response.
So what's the response then? How does one Like if I become aware that this is happening to me, what do I do practically?
Yeah.
Take deep
So
breaths.
yeah, so some of it depends, I think, on where you fall in terms of your own pattern of responding to activation. So
Okay.
almost all of this is coming from some kind of nervous system activation, which
Right.
is a really, it's a beautiful, it's exquisite system that exists in all of us as humans, and it's
Yeah.
very well equipped to deal with physical threats in our environment. Now it's most responsive to cognitive or psychological threats, and
Yeah.
it hasn't really responded as well to those kinds of threats. Well, I should say it responds the exact same way, as though the cognitive threat was the same as a physical threat, right?
Mhm.
It just, our systems are responding the same way. So some of it is, again, sort of recognizing, really it's sort of, I almost like to do like a 3-point check. How are things in my head? How are things in my heart or emotional space? And how are things in my body? And you
Right.
can do that 3-point check-in pretty quickly, particularly once you get used to it. You
Used to
can
it.
sort of
Yeah.
notice, like, I'm thinking about something that is frustrating me. My emotional space is one of irritation or not getting my needs met. My body is, my shoulders are touching my ears, or I'm feeling this tension in the back of my neck. And so that 3-point check-in, I think, is a very portable skill for cultivating self-awareness.
Mhm.
And then depending on what you find there, that's where sort of the skill or the strategy sort of depends on what you find there. So if you're somebody who has, some activation in the body, your heart's racing, something like, a breathing technique can be really helpful to start to down regulate and bring your heart rate down.
Yeah. Right. Right.
A very a cleansing breath, a belly breath, or a really long exhale can really help to bring our heart rate down. If it's happening in conversation with somebody, we can also do that quick check-in. We can do things where we slow down our pace of our voice, of talking.
Right.
We can
Right.
reposition ourselves so that we put our feet on the floor and feel really grounded. That will send a message to our nervous system around safety.
And also there, safety. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, here.
safety and
We're on
grounding.
ground.
Because
Right.
if you're really needing to fight or flight, right? That's you're going to be on your toes. Like there's some, you gotta have some movement. But when you can put your feet flat on the floor, you're sending a signal through your posture to your nervous system that, oh, okay, we're planted here. It's okay. It's safe. If you are somebody who does, if you get activated and your check-in tells you your tendency is that you want to get away, withdraw, kind of run away. Again, doing something in your physical posture where you might even do something that's, open, like literally opening the palms to the palms of your hand. So withdrawing has this contraction quality.
Yeah.
So if you notice that in yourself, like you do that check-in, you're like, I just want to get away, get away, get away. But there's no real threat there other than maybe the story you're creating in your head. You can work with your body posture to do something that feels like, okay, I'm going to stay open. Or placing a hand on your heart and just making that
Literally
connection.
putting it up there. Yeah.
So I do a lot of those things within my own clinical practice and working with people. I always want to, first and foremost, stay present. In a lot of my work, I'm hearing stories that people don't want to tell and nobody else wants to hear.
Right. True.
And yet it's so important that people give words and voice and airtime to things that they are holding. I think Maya Angelou said something like, there's no greater burden than a story untold.
you keep yourself nice and happy and bubbly like you are.
I too, go through all the permutations of challenges of life and living this life in a pandemic. I do have a steady meditation practice.
Being a psychologist, you can tune in like that to all your faculties and get it all high-tuned.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something that that I think for people who are in health professionals, it's so much of our identity, and it's so much of where we put a lot of hours of our day and a lot of weeks of our year and a lot of years of our life. When the joy goes out of that and it becomes, very rote, and it's tragic. It's tragic because you've dedicated so much to this profession and to this identity. So my work brings me a ton of joy.
Yeah, true.
And working with health professionals, and I always work in, I'm always working again at that intersection of what's happening for them personally and how they can bring this to their doctoring, so that it's not an either or proposition. It's not like, well, you're not doing so well emotionally because you're a doctor. But it's like, how do you bring those together? And for some people that may mean making shifts in where they work or how they work, very concretely, like logistically. And for a lot of people, it means just making some shifts in how they work, in how they show up, and how they can be in presence with their patients and not hold so much responsibility for every outcome, in a sense. Not that you don't. It's a fine line in medicine, right? Not that you say, well, it's not my responsibility, but that you don't hook your own well-being and your own esteem on these outcomes for your patients or outcomes for whatever system you're working with, because we get pretty used to just jumping the next hurdle or crossing the next finish line. But if we don't carry our joy throughout the whole process, then it's pretty flat, uninspiring experience when we cross the finish line, or when we jump the next hurdle or the next accolade or the next promotion, because we have been so cut off to the experience along the way. So I get a lot of joy in my work.
Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Christine Runyan is a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is a Certified Mindfulness Teacher. She co-founded and co-leads Tend Health, a clinical consulting practice focused on the mental well-being of healthcare practitioners. You can learn more about that at tend.health. HEARTtalk brings to you real-life issues concerning health, well-being, and spiritual living. Do visit our HEARTtalk website at www.hearttalk.com.my. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, HEARTtalk with Dr. Charles Lee, and we would love to hear from you by writing to us at charleshearttalk@gmail.com. Let's talk soon.